Good morning, family. So this morning I wanted to share something from Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. It's a verse we're familiar with in our church. We've talked about it. In Romans 12 verse 1 it says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." There's a picture last week in the church service. I don't know if you remember, but I remember this picture of the Holy Spirit as the one who's come without a body to the world, and he wants a body. And the question came to me, will I give him mine? Will I give him my body completely and free for his life and his use to live in my body? And it's really stuck with me, and it's shown me that as I've been meditating on it, I don't feel I've ever really seen how completely God wanted me to give my life to him and surrender everything to him. Sandy mentioned surrender a moment ago. I really feel this week I've seen a whole other level of surrender, which I've never seen before, as I thought about this verse and thought about that picture. There's a great line, I don't know if anyone's ever read that old book by C.S. Lewis called The Screwtape Letters, which is basically a bunch of letters from supposedly a senior demon to kind of a junior demon, teaching the demon how to deceive his patient, or the man that he's kind of responsible for tempting. It's a good book. I'd recommend it. But there's one line, I was just looking at it recently, and there's one line in it which really stood out to me. It said something to the effect of, make sure your patient believes that the 24 hours he has every day are his own possession, and they're in his inalienable right, like his birthright. Make sure your man believes that the 24 hours every day are his possession. And it really struck me as it pertains to this idea of surrender, this idea of total consecration to God. And it convicted me because, even though it sounds ridiculous when we say it like that, in fact, Uncle Screwtape says, don't let this idea enter his mind because it sounds ridiculous as soon as the idea comes in. But it does sound ridiculous, and yet I feel as I really examine my own life, I have to be honest and say, that's the way I spend many of my days. My 24 hours are mine. The default is they're mine. And yet, when we're born again, when we're born of the Spirit, God's desire is that everything in our lives is his. That every hour, every moment of every day is his. And our money is the Lord's money, as we've heard. Our time is the Lord's time. Our thoughts are the Lord's thoughts. I remember a few months ago at one of our brothers' meetings, one of the brothers, and just kind of in passing, said something to the effect of, I have to be really careful about how I spend the Lord's money. He said that, and it really struck me because, I was convicted by it because I had just, maybe a week before, I had given a donation to a friend who had asked for donations for this cause. And I realized I did it unthinkingly, that because it's a good cause, he's a friend, I thought it's tax deductible gift, right? So I just gave to him kind of without thinking. And when that brother at the brothers meeting said, I have to be really careful how I spend the Lord's money. And he was talking about in the context of giving, not in the context of buying clothes or something, but even in giving, I have to be careful about how I spend the Lord's money. It really convicted me. Wow, I wasn't careful about that. I wasn't really careful to ask, God, is this how you want me to spend your money? Even though it's a gift, even though it's supporting a nonprofit, and am I careful? And I wasn't really serious about that money, and I wasn't really serious that it's God's money and not mine. And I was thankful when a couple weeks later, I'm sure all of us from our alma maters, we get regular emails asking us to donate, right? There's some campaign, and we're supposed to donate to the college or something. And I got in the annual update, and I kind of mindlessly clicked through, and I was going through the online donation form and doing all this stuff. And then just like a thunderbolt to my heart, the question just came to me, hey, Jeremy, that's my money. Be careful how you spend it. And I was really convicted, and I thought, oh, wow. It's kind of like snapped me out of just my default is like, oh, of course I'll support them. It's a good thing to do. But I wasn't thinking, God, this is your money. How do you want me to spend it? And I was really thankful for that God gave me that opportunity to judge myself and to change just a couple weeks after I realized I'd been in the wrong. Well, then this week, as I was considering this verse in Romans 12 and presenting our bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, completely acceptable to God, I had lots of those kinds of moments with the Lord as well. I heard the same voice again so strongly. I mean, a lot of random examples, but a magazine came in the mail. And I get home and, when I look through the mail, I kind of think like, oh, good, that's going to take me 1 minute to read. That's going to take me 3 minutes, kind of do the inventory. And there's certain magazines I like because they don't take very long to read. It's kind of weird, but I like kind of the feeling of accomplishment. And, I read it in 5 minutes and throw it in the trash, and it's like, got it, did it. And I kind of saw this magazine, and I thought, oh, yeah, good, okay, great. I'm going to get to read that a little bit later. And immediately the thought came to my mind, Jeremy, this is my time. Be careful how you spend it. It's my time. You've given yourself to me. You said you want to surrender yourself completely to me. Is this how you want to spend my time? And I immediately thought back to that, being in that web portal and thinking about, this is my money. How are you going to spend it? Do you want to ask me even? At the very least, ask me. And then, later in the week, I found myself I biked to work, and I was kind of biking, mindlessly humming some sugary pop song. I don't even know, those like earworms they just get in your mind. And I was just mindlessly humming some song, but it was kind of filling my mind. It's amazing how little capacity we have sometimes. It's like some silly song can fill your mind. And I felt again that voice come back and say, Jeremy, these are my thoughts. Be careful how you spend them. They're my thoughts. What are you spending them on? Are you actually proactively setting aside your money, setting aside your time, setting aside your thoughts and say, God, I want to truly be surrendered to you. I want to be available to you. Your Holy Spirit came to this earth in search of a body. You have mine, truly. And it's very practical. It's kind of very specific. And there's lots of experiences like that have shown me this week that my default is to do my own thing. Just generally speaking, in my flesh, it's just do my own thing. Not that it's outwardly sinful or anything like that. It's just I'm rooted in my flesh. And yet, I've always thought, oh, God will intervene. And if I'm not doing the thing I should be doing, He'll direct me. And I think that's true, absolutely. But what I thought this week is, that's not really surrender. That's not the definition of surrender, is doing your own thing and then trusting God to intervene. Surrender is deciding not to do my own thing. Saying, I don't want to do my own thing at all. I don't want to think my own thoughts. I don't want to spend my own money. I don't want to spend my time in the way I want to. I would rather wait and hear from God. The line that kind of came to my mind this week is, I'd rather do nothing and be found waiting for Him than do something, even that's permissible, and somehow miss His voice because my mind was already filled too much. I'd rather do nothing. Because what do I get to do? In those moments, if I'm doing nothing, I can retreat inwardly and have fellowship with God. And what's better than that? There's nothing better than that. There was a brother this week who talked about, how do the angels obey in heaven? They sit in God's presence and they're worshiping Him. And then if you ask Him to do something, they quickly leave and they do what He says, and then they come back. And I was just thinking about that, how different, if I'm honest, so much of my life and my mind is. That I'm doing whatever I have to do, and then I expect God will call me and then I'll come and listen, rather than just saying, I don't have anything I have to do, Lord. I have no agenda. There's nothing in my mind that I have to do today, other than wait on you and listen to you. And if you have nothing for me, guess what? In your presence is fullness of joy. There's nothing else I want. If you have nothing for me, great. I was thinking about how quickly the angels must want to come back to Him, because whatever their errand is can't be as exciting as being with Him, right? And yet, I think I was just convicted. I just don't have the chance just to sit, because I fill my time with the default of, I have so many things that I do myself. But it's not condemning. I want to say that. I've not found this to be condemning at all. I found it to be freeing. I feel I've had more joyous interactions with the Lord this week than I can remember in a long time. I feel I'm convinced it's because He had more of me, because I was deciding I wanted to give Him, and I wanted to take me from me. I wanted to stop offering myself to myself by default, but rather be proactively submitting myself to Him. And I found I wasn't, in none of those examples that I share with you was I condemned. In all of them I was overjoyed, because I got the chance to be with Him every time. And it's only as I started kind of overcoming proactively some of my defaults that I realized there's a lot more space for me to fellowship with God than I knew. There's a lot more bandwidth for me to be freed up to interact with Him and listen to Him and meditate on His Word than I ever knew before. Because there are all of these parts of my life that I didn't even know it, but I hadn't really truly surrendered. And I found rest and joy and peace and hope boundlessly, I truly say. I found God's love more fulfilling and His promise so much more near by abandoning myself every time that I was reminded of it. Whenever I abandoned myself, I found God's love more fulfilling than whatever I was doing before. And my flesh and its love for the world keeps trying to write these thoughts off as crazy, right? It's too extreme. It's too radical. Stop being so ridiculous. It's like, that's what my flesh keeps saying. And yet, I found it to be so helpful in my spiritual life to not listen to those feelings of doubt. And am I giving too much? Is this really what God asks? But instead, honestly evaluate, why do I do everything that I do? The things that I'm doing, why do I do them? Is it because God has told me he wants me to? Or is it because it's my default? It's what I always do. It's not sinful. There's nothing wrong with it. It's permissible. Or am I seeking to be as one sent, who's sitting, waiting at the feet of my loving, kind master and king, who I love being with him most, and then whatever I do only because he said to do it. That's it. That's the only reason, because he said to do it. And there's a good story in the Old Testament that I read. I feel honesty in prayer in this particular. I don't know about you, but when I think about this, I search my heart. All of a sudden, there's things that get brought to my mind, and I think, surely you aren't asking me for that, God. There's no way. I like reading, for example. Since I was a kid, love reading. I'm convinced I damaged my eyes because when the car was so dark at night, I would just sit reading in the back seat. And there are lots of times I feel like there's lots of books I want to read, in my life. I've heard they're good books. And anytime these thoughts kind of come into my mind of absolute surrender, one of my first thoughts is, what if I don't get to read some book? It's stupid thoughts, right? But I find I've got to be honest with God in my prayers and not be fearful, but just be honest and say, Lord, what do you want today? Not worry about forever, but what do you want today? I'll do what you want today. But there's this example. It's in 2 Chronicles. We can turn there. It's 2 Chronicles 18. And it's a story about basically Ahab and Jehoshaphat are kind of teaming up. And Ahab has got in his mind that he wants to invade some country. And he brings Jehoshaphat and says, hey, Jehoshaphat, will you promise that you'll be with me? And Jehoshaphat says, sure, but hey, just inquire of the Lord. Make sure that the Lord wants you to do it. And so Ahab gathers, I'm trying to condense because it's a long story, but Ahab gathers 200 prophets to him and says, guys, should I do it? And they all say, absolutely, it's of the Lord, do it. And Jehoshaphat says, okay, are you really sure? Is this what is there not a real prophet here? I think Jehoshaphat kind of knew. I don't get the sense these guys are really seeking the Lord. And so Ahab answers and says, there's this one prophet, but he hates me, and he always prophesies against me. And his name's Micaiah. And so he says, call Micaiah and let's see what he has to say. And we can pick it up in verse 12. It says, the messenger who went to summon Micaiah spoke to him, saying, behold, the words of the prophets, all these 200 people, are uniformly favorable to the king and his kind of preconceived plan. So please, let your word be like one of them and speak favorably. But Micaiah said, as the Lord lives, what my God says, thus I will speak. And this is where it gets interesting to me. When he came to the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go to battle, or shall I refrain? And he said, this is interesting, go up and succeed, for they will be given into your hand. Then the king said to him, how many times must I adjure you to speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? So Micaiah said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each of them return to his house in peace. Basically, don't go. You're going to be scattered. And Ahab gets mad. But what I see here is, it's a really interesting lesson for me, is that when Micaiah originally spoke, he just told Ahab what he wanted to hear. Ahab had in his mind a plan, what he wanted to do, and he rightly asked the prophet to speak to him. And you know what the prophet said? Exactly what he wanted to hear. And I believe it's because God knew Ahab's heart. He knew his heart, and he knew that he didn't really want to be told no. He knew that all he wanted was a sign-off on the plans he already had made. And he came to God only looking to be signed off on what he had already decided he wanted to do. And this story showed me a really important lesson, that if we aren't truly interested in knowing God's will specifically, in very specific circumstances, with even the most trivial things, and especially when we already have our own agenda, but if we're only interested in getting a sign-off on what we already want, then we will get what we came for. We'll get permission. But it's not God that gives it to us. It's our own conscience, or not even our conscience, but our own mind. I don't know where it comes from. I know I can say honestly, there are many times where I've told myself I'm seeking the Lord, but I really get the answer that I want. And what this story told me is, God knows my heart. And if I don't really want to know what he has to say, he'll let me believe that I've heard from him and say, yeah, give you permission, do that thing that you want. But I've got to be careful to not go to the Lord with some predetermined idea about what he's asking for, some agenda, saying, Lord, do you mind if I do such and such thing when my mind's already made up? I've got to really come to him and seek to deny myself and seek to truly accept his will fully, whatever he will say. And I found there are lots of things in my life that I've been permitted to do only because I've honestly never considered whether they should be there. I just never really considered it. I've never taken the time to say, Lord, what about this? Do you want this even? And I find that as I prayed these prayers this week, if I do have an agenda, start by confessing it to the Lord and say, Lord, this is what I want. But I don't just want you to tell me that what I want's okay. I really want to know what you want. And so I ask you to cleanse my motives, cleanse my intention, cleanse my heart, that I would not be just hearing from my own mind when I come to you, but that I'd really be hearing what your will is. And I'd be willing to accept it, even if it's contrary to my will. I'd be willing to accept it. The Romans passage that I start out with, in the next verse it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what God's will is, what his perfect and acceptable will is. And I just close by saying there are a few simple things which I've learned this week in trying to really approve what God's will is and not be conformed to the pattern of this world. And one is regarding worldly pleasures, regarding things that I enjoy, which are permissible, but even those things which I want to submit to the Lord. What I feel I've learned this week is, don't think about what I'm missing out on, miss the pain or what I'm losing over time. It's not, I don't get to read that book, in my case. It's, what do I get? Focus on what I get. And when God tells me, spend time with me, you know what I get? I get perfect peace. Perfect peace. This is my testimony. I get perfect joy. I get perfect rest. It's better, and I promise you, it's better than any book I've ever read. Hearing no. It's better, really, but it's when I honestly come to him and say, Lord, what do you want? And so focus on what I'm gaining, not what I'm supposedly losing. And the other thing that I've learned is, don't be intimidated by this call, by the prospect of surrendering forever. There's that passage that we all love, that we've heard many times here. It's in Matthew 11, where Jesus says, come to me if you're weary and heavy laden. Matthew 11:28. It says in verse 29, take my yoke upon me and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. And I've always thought about that as, come learn gentleness and humility from me. Take my yoke, because you need to learn gentleness and humility. But I think that's true, absolutely. But the other thing that I've seen this week is, the reason I can come confidently to him and the reason I can say, what is your yoke, Lord? What do you want from me, Lord? Is because of his gentleness. It's because of his humility. He is gentle with me. When I come to him and when I truly, genuinely want to hear from him, he's gentle and humble of heart towards me. And I've learned this week that his yoke gives rest. It truly does. Because the moment that I'm determined to obey, he himself gives me the strength that I need and the joy that I need to obey.